ध्वनिर्वर्णा पदं वाक्यमित्यास्पद चतुष्टयम् यस्याः सूक्ष्मादि भेदे वाग्देवीं तामुपास्महे।
Electronic Media Production and Research Center EMPRC of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University presents its audio program series Art and Culture. Friends, you are going to listen to Professor Settar. He is discussing the topic Artisans of Mouryan Age. This lecture will be divided into two parts. Let's listen to the first part of audio lecture on Artisans of Mouryan Age. This audio program is recorded, edited and presented by Amar Bahadur Yadav.
Who are the earliest artists known to India, and which is the state which made use of the artists in a very extensive way? These are the questions which are not answered so far. I feel that the state which made the use of the artists in a very extensive way, so much so that it depended on the artists themselves, is the state of the Mauryas under Ashoka. The artists existed even earlier than the period of Ashoka or of the Mauryas. Right from the time of the Indus to the megalithic period, we find the artists working in one way or the other in India. But their names are not known. We do not know whether they were employed by anybody. Certainly, there was no empire which employed any artists and paid them. But when Ashoka began to spread Dhamma and Purana Pukiti, he suddenly realized that he cannot afford to do it unless he has a large body of artists. And without their help, he could not disseminate the knowledge or the Dharma itself. He needed artists, to compose edicts. He needed scribes to engrave them on rock beds and pillars. He needed sculptors to carve plaques and also the pillars and the capitals. He needed artists to build towns, palaces, and whatnot. Ashoka ruled over a vast territory, as we all know. The territory extended from one end of the country to another. And his works of art are seen from Lagman to Brahmagiri in the south, and from Girnar to Mahasthana in the east. That means to see that he was covering the entire country, more or less from Afghanistan down to the Tungabhadra river in the south, and Girnar in the west to Mahasthana in the east. He needed artists, not only to go to these places and carve the edicts, which he had issued, but he also needed artists to understand the language and translate them to the people and in their language. For example, he issued a large number of, at least 4 different types of edicts. The most popular edicts were the Brahmi edicts, expressing the Prakrit language. Brahmi is the script and Prakrit is the language. There are 7 recensions of this text all over the country. The second one was the Greek edict. Both the Greek script and the Greek language used. And then there was the Aramaic script and language. 2 recensions of these edicts are found in the country. Kharosthi also used, and a mixed language like the Greek and the Aramaic used in Kandhar. That means Brahmi and Prakrit, the Greek language, Aramaic language, and Kharosthi language, and somebody who knew both the Greek and the Aramaic. At least about 5 different types of artists he used. Did these artists know the language in which they carved the edicts? Certainly. They belonged to the place where this language was known. They lived in that place, and they probably executed the edicts which were supplied to them either by the composers or they had to do it themselves. Most probably, they merely carved the texts which were given by the composers. Well, he insisted that his edict should be carved on lasting material, and the lasting material was the stone itself. He said wherever there are stone pillars, the edict should be carved on them. And from the examples available, we know that at least 2 or 3 different surfaces were used for carving the edicts. One is the pillar, which existed earlier, or which are specially prepared for this purpose. They may be pillars, without capitals. They may be pillars with capitals. The pillars with capitals became most ornate ones, freestanding pillars, and they are not only merely the surfaces on which the edicts were engraved, but they are also great pieces of art. And the capitals which surmounted these pillars are some of the wonderful creations of the Mouryan period. Well, he also established certain stelas, the slabs on which these were carved. And apart from this, sometimes the edicts were also carved on the wall surfaces of the caves. So rock cutting was a very important aspect. And to cut the rocks, he needed somebody who was not merely a mason or a rock cutter, but also somebody who could follow the letters. So with this body of craftsmen, artists and artisans, he was able to spread the mission of Dharma from Lagman in the northwest to Brahmagiri in the south, and from Girnar to Mahasthana in the east. He covered the entire country. Well, what kind of art was produced during the Mouryan period, particularly during the time of Ashoka? We all know that apart from the edicts, he also issued, or this period witnessed the emergence of a large number of plaques, in which you find the narrative art also. It is a very fine workmanship. These are confined to the heartland of Mauryas. They are not found in the extreme south. They are in very large number. And these large number of plaques were actually carved by the artists who belonged to this area. Then there were these pillars which are made specially and polished. And the Mouryan polished gained such an importance that preparation of the pillar involved 3 stages. One is the selection of a rock, rough cutting of a rock into a shape of a pillar, then final finishing of the rock itself into a finished pillar, and then polishing the rock. And then apart from this, there was also creation of a special capital which surmounted these pillars. So the pillars became very, very important part of the Mouryan art. And the Mouryan polish became legendary because it was so glossy and so good that probably to this day, it is unrivaled or unexcelled by any artist. Well, this is the situation. Who were the artists who were available to Ashoka at that time? This is a question which is of some interest. A large number of artists were available in the country, but they were not employed by the state till then. He must have looked around and found out who are the people who are available to him. Well, first of all, there were the artists who are the distant descendants of the Harappan period. Well, they were working till in the megalithic milieu. So those who came down from the Harappan period into the megalithic period were all indigenous or local, or people who shared common skills. Then there were the descendants of the Greek, that is the Gandharan, and also Achaemenid Persian, that is Western artisans. Well, after the fall of the Greek and the Achaemenid empires, more or less these artists were idle and they were looking forward to an opportunity to distinguish themselves. Well, there are also native artists under the influence who had come under the influence of the Hellenic as well as the Achaemenid art, but they had also lost patronage after the fall of these dynasties. In addition to this, there are also native artists or regional artists. You call them either folk artists or artists in general or craftsmen. So these are the 4 different varieties of artists which were available in the country for Ashoka. Only he had to make up his mind to patronize them, and he has to find out who was most suitable for his work. Well, if there were artists and art schools, whether there are art schools is another question which comes out of it. We hardly have any evidence to show that there are art schools, but there are certainly the art communities of craftsmen who safeguarded their tools and techniques continuously and transferred them from father to son. And this kind of of the development of the arts and the crafts had been taking place for ages and for centuries. Well, in spite of it, we may say that there may have been certain centers where the artists concentrated. One of the centers is cited by the historians is Taxila or Takshashila. It was supposed to be a center of Aramic, that is to say later Kharosthi artisans of Hellenic and Achaemenid descendants who came and settled down in Taxila. Taxila is supposed to have connected Pataliputra with Hellenic Empire. And come to think of it, Takshashila itself means, Taksha means carpenter and the woodworker. And Kashtakarma is considered to be the earlier form of working with the wood. And all the artists who worked on the wood later on came to be called as the sculptors also. Even in the late medieval time, hardly any distinction was made between the carpenter and the sculptor. Though certain communities specialized in wood carving and certain other communities specialized in stone carving. Apart from Takshashila, perhaps there were also other art centers, but we do not have very clear idea about these centers. But from the evidence available, the archaeological evidence available, and also the indirect references made in literature, we learn that Pataliputra may have been a center. Obviously, it was a metropolis of Mouryan Empire and there could have been a concentration of artists there because Pataliputra was a very extensive town and an extensive urban complex. And it needed not only to construct but to maintain several artists. Well, the famous art center, I would say not the art center, but the center from which the stone was derived, the medium which was required for the Mauryas, was Chunar itself. Well, Chunar quarry is a very important quarry because it is from Chunar that most of the Mouryan stone was dug out and used. And probably to supply enough amount of stone from a single quarry, a large concentration of artists were required. Well, whether they were the trained artists or merely stone cutters who dug out from the earth the stone and supplied it to others, one doesn't know. But during the early phase of the history, to think in terms of the separation of activity as stone cutters and sculptors is difficult to imagine. My feeling is that the stone cutters were also stone dressers, and stone dressers were also those who finished the pillars. And there was hardly any distinction between the two, the stone cutters and the artists. It is possible that some of the stone cutters never promoted themselves to the level of becoming artists, but nonetheless, they formed a common community. That is an important thing. Is there any other center that we can think of in the early phases of history or the early phase of history as the center of art or the center where the artists concentrated themselves? We have really no idea. Chunar was certainly a center because it was a quarry area. Pataliputra could be defined as a center of activity because it was a metropolis of the Mouryan Empire and it needed a large body of artisans to maintain and sustain the city itself, and naturally their presence could be imagined. But if you go through the Jatakas and other stories and indirect references that we get, probably Mathura, Varanasi, Kausambi, Rajagriha, Shravasti may qualify to become centers of art at that time. We will come back to some of these centers to find out whether there is any substance to prove that they were centers of artistic activity. Who are these artists? Were they paid for or were they forced to work? And such questions are asked in the history of the artisans and the history of art also. Well, we know that both Kautilya and even Ashoka both say that there were slaves in the society. They make a reference to the slaves in society, but they do not make specific reference to the slave artists. The slave artists of the kind are the workmen that we find in, for example, in Egypt. For building pyramids, a large number of slaves were used. Slave labor formed the major workforce, see, in Egypt. But similar kind of situation one can hardly imagine, because see, the Mauryan Empire needed to pamper and protect the artists if they have to get the proper work done by them, and they had to be paid for. Well, if Kautilya says something about the slaves, and Ashoka asked the slaves to be treated, see, very kindly by the householders, it doesn't mean that they were the slaves. See, the artisans were the slaves, and they could be forced to work anywhere and everywhere without being paid. This is more or less indirectly, supported by Megasthenes. Megasthenes says, see, that the artisans were very well looked after by the state. They got the state subsidy. They got the state protection. For example, he makes a reference that if the hand of the artisan is cut off, his compensation is to be secured for him, and the man who injures him will have to be punished. So he also goes to the extent to say, see, that the artisans were exempted from certain taxes, which means by the time Megasthenes came here and observed the working conditions, even earlier than the time of Ashoka himself, it is obvious that the artisans had earned a place for themselves. But still, there was no evidence. There is no evidence to show that they were state-employed forces. Artisans those days, in the pre-Ashokan times, probably needed to supply the major and essential tools for agriculture, irrigation, and such other things, to improve the economy. They were part of the workforce of the village or of the town or of the rural area. But they were not required to go from one end of the country to another end to spread a specific mission which the king wanted to spread. And that is the difference between the pre-Ashokan period and the post-Ashokan period or Ashokan period. When Ashoka created a situation where his mission is to be spread from one end of the country to another end, he had not only to continue to protect the artists, but also promote their interest and pay them more than the usual kind of rewards, provide additional incentives to make them come out of their moorings. And in this context, if you examine who are the artists who are prepared to go from one end of the country to another end, we zero down to one specific community, and that community is the Kharoshti community. I call this Kharoshti from the word which has been used in one of the inscriptions. Kharoshti is a language, Kharoshti is a script. But those who continued to write and read, naturally they were called the Kharoshtis here. Kharoshti emerged out of the Aramic language. When Aramic language was not able to express everything, that the Prakrit needed to be expressed, then Kharoshti was also involved. Well, these Kharoshtis, belonged to the northwestern part of India, but they were very adventurous people. Earlier, they had served the Persian state, and after the fall of the Persian state, with all the skill that they had, they had become idle, and they were waiting for an opportunity which any imperial authority could provide them to distinguish themselves. In the meanwhile, they had gradually begun to spread themselves to other parts of the country in search of opportunities. We don't know when Ashoka started disseminating his Dhamma, whether they were still concentrating in the Peshawar region or in the northwestern part, or whether they had moved out of that moorings and reached Takshashila, or they had even come nearer to the following the Ganges river, come up to Chunar or Pataliputra. We have no idea. But certainly during the time of Ashoka, we do find them, not only in Takshashila, but also along the river Ganges, concentrating themselves in large number at Chunar Quarry, and probably in Pataliputra also. There are archaeological evidence to show that in Pataliputra they existed. There is enough number of evidence, enough number of inscriptional evidence to show that they were in Chunar region itself. Now, we do not have the slave, but these could not have been slaves, because you cannot make slaves to migrate from one end to another unless you forcefully bring them to Chunar region. But my own feeling is they came to Chunar region because that was one place which provided them the maximum employment. and they dug out of the stone and they began to dress the stone there, and then it's a rough cut of the pillars were prepared there. Then they were transported. Whether the stone cutters were merely cutting the stone, digging out of the stone and preparing the rough cuts, or whether they were also in the transportation, they shoulder the responsibility of the transportation, we do not know. But probably, if you go by the later examples and the present day examples also, the stone cutters were also transporters of the stone, and that must have increased the workforce in Chunar. So they came in large number to Chunar, and they began to live there. They began to thrive there, and probably they also got rewards for their work. Well, Kharoshtis were adventurous, as I told earlier. One group of Kharoshtis came from Takshashila to Chunar, from there to Pataliputra. Whether a section of the artists who had come to Chunar, did they come down to south also, we do not know. Or whether they took independent path and came to Brahmagiri, we do not know. But most probably, after reaching Pataliputra, after collecting the texts of the edicts, some of these artists appears to have sent down to the south.
You have just heard the first part of audio lecture on Artisans of Mouryan age. The lecture was delivered by Professor Settar. The announcements were made by Kaushal Sharma. This program is recorded, edited and presented to you by Amar Bahadur Yadav. This audio program was produced and presented by Electronic Media Production and Research Center (EMPRC) of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University.